Welcome to today's Religion Media Centre briefing, which is about reporting data on religion. So we'll be reviewing how the data is compiled, the kind of questions that are asked, and how we can trust the findings. And our panel includes Conrad Hackett, the Senior Demographer and Associate Director of Research at Pew Research Centre, Dr. Peter Brierley from the Brierley Consultancy on the compilation of church statistics in Britain, and Professor David Voas from the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex, but also National Programme Director in Great Britain for the European Values Study and co-director of the British Religion in Numbers project. I think I've capsulated everything there, David. Thank you all very much for joining, and I know that you all know each other, so hopefully we'll have a very interesting discussion today. Perhaps if I could start with you, Conrad, to kick us off, and it's good to see you contributing from America. Thank you for waking up early to do so. Can I ask you, first of all, general question? Many of us will have heard of Pew Research. Can you explain to us something about the work that you do as it relates to religion? How many researchers you have, how long you've been going, what kind of topics you cover?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. First of all, I wanted to say that it seems fitting to acknowledge the special sauce of the religion team at the Pew Research Center is that we've got a mix of people like myself who are trained as social scientists and lots of journalists on our staff. And we're really unique in that sense because the mix of academic, trained social scientists who can make sure we're doing research at the highest levels of rigor and journalists who can make sure that we communicate this excellent research to a wide audience and that we ask questions that people care about and that we're not just pursuing some esoteric questions is really important. And we also have great graphic designers that make beautiful charts and communications professionals that help us interface with journalists outside the organization. So that's one reason why we're special. In terms of history, we've been going now for well over a decade, and our religion team started as a part of a smaller Pew Research Center, initially just convening people to talk about new books put out by academics. We get a few journalists together, have a nice lunch, and then we grew an ambition to be a leading resource for reporting on religion around the world, something that people could turn to for a variety of topics. The Pew Research Center, more broadly, has about 160 full time people working at the institution. We're funded primarily by the Pew Charitable Trust, which is an organization set up by family members associated with the Sun Oil Company. They put these money in trust decades ago. It supports all kinds of good work, including the Pew Research Center. And then many teams within Pew receive extra support from other outside organizations. And our international religion research is supported by the John Templeton Foundation. We have a wonderful relationship with them. And in terms of what we do, we have several subunits. One unit focuses on doing a ton of surveys about religion in the US and going in depth about all facets of US religious dynamics. Then we have a team that's doing international religion research with surveys, and they've gone around the world and surveyed each region of the world. Now we're wrapping up this march through the world's regions with reports on religion in different parts of Asia, and I'm really looking forward to the report on East Asia that the team is currently working on. We have a team that studies the freedom of religion around the world by measuring the limits on religious freedom, the religious restrictions and social hostilities involving religion. And then finally, I lead a team that studies the international demography of religion, looking at how the size of religious groups is changing around the world and the characteristics of those groups and how those are changing.
Can I ask you a particular question about your research on global religious affiliation? Use that word. You can tell me if that's the word you use in your research. What do we know? What have you found about religious observance, affiliation, membership around the world, and how have you measured it?
A lot of countries, like the UK, include a measure of religious identity in a census. And so usually when we can rely on census data, we use that to figure out how people identify themselves religiously. In other countries like the US, religion is not part of the census. And so we rely on the best survey data that asks about, in which people answer a question like, what is your religion, if any? And we know that that doesn't tell the whole story of religion. There are a lot of people who occasionally do religious things, even though they say they don't have a religion, and a lot of people who say, "Oh, I'm Catholic or Church of England," but never go to church and only weekly observe those things. So, although it's an imperfect clue to the full religious life of a person, those generally it's highly correlated how you identify and what you do religiously, and it's something that we can better track in every country of the world than other measures which aren't asked the same way in all surveys. So that's what we rely on, is how people identify.
So you're finding that 84% of the world's population is religious. How was that compiled? Because that phrase is used a lot in stories about religion and non-religion over here.
Well, we added up the statistics for every country. So you have a lot of countries, and this is that 84% statistic is from 2010. We're working on an update for 2020, and I'm sure that the number has changed. Uh, but there are some countries like uh, the Czech Republic or China, where the share of people who do not identify with any religion is very high, even the majority of the population. Other countries that have moved into that category over the last decade. And then, yet again, countries like the US, where still the majority of the population clearly identifies with some religion. So it's the aggregate of countries that are majority non religious and majority religious, and everything in between.
Thank you very much for introducing the subject today and going over to Professor David Voas, if I may, next. One of the answers that Conrad gave there about how Pew Research assesses religious identity. Can you explain to us the crucial thing that people need to understand when they're looking at data about religion as to what exactly it identifies and what it tells us?
Religion clearly has a number of aspects, and those of us who work in this field tend to think of three in particular. There's affiliation or self-identification that we've just been discussing. There's belief in God or the divinity of Jesus or any other point of religious doctrine. And then there's practice. So that's going to worship, privately praying, and so on. So affiliation, belief, and practice are the three key dimensions that we tend to think of. And although, as Conrad says, they're correlated, they by no means completely overlap. There are many more people who say that they have a religion than who actually do anything about it. And there are some people who have beliefs in supernatural powers who say they don't have a religion. So it can be complicated. We owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to people like Conrad and Peter on the panel who are very actively involved in doing these measurements. And I think the kinds of measures that Conrad and Peter respectively are most closely associated with give us, if you like, the upper and lower bounds on what we might think of as being religious. So on the one hand, self-identification or affiliation gives us what I think is perhaps the largest estimate or the most expansive and inclusive estimate of the religious population. It's simply saying, oh yes, I would call myself a Christian or I'm a Muslim. That doesn't necessarily mean that people have the associated beliefs or are engaged in practice on any regular basis. Peter Brierley, on the other hand, has over many, many years and decades been involved, especially in measuring practice and church attendance, specifically in Great Britain. Now, these days, it's a relatively small share of the population that is going to church. Those who do clearly count as religious in almost all cases, there are some people who are taking elderly parents to church, for example. But in general, I think it's fair to say that those engaged in attending worship services do count as religious. But we would probably want to think of many more people as being religious because they have the associated beliefs. Perhaps they think of themselves as being religious, having a religion, and so on. So and the difference between these measures can be enormous. You can have more than half the population saying they have a religion, and as few as 10% or even less actually doing anything practical about it.
So I suppose that this is the challenge for journalists when the surveys or the census comes out. You have different companies or different organizations that produce different results. So, for example, in the census, it said that less than 47% of the population was Christian, 37% was non-religious. But in the British Social Attitudes Survey of 2019, which is often quoted in this country, it puts the number of non-religious at 52%. So 52% against 37%. How do we know what is the truth?
Well, they're both the truth. They're just slightly different truths. So the questions are subtly different, but even minor changes in the question and the response options offered, not to mention the context and so on, can have a huge difference on how people respond. So the census question is, what is your religion? Some people, including, for example, the Humanists UK, say that's very leading. It implies that you have a religion. The British Social Attitudes question is, do you regard yourself as belonging to a particular religion? And you could say the reverse about that. Maybe belonging seems to be a rather strong term, implying that you're actually a member of a congregation, for example. So the way people answer the question is very much a function of exactly how it's phrased, and also, of course, what the answers offered are. So on the census, you have just the major world religions, including no religion, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, so on. And you would tick one of those boxes. On the British Social Attitudes Survey, you get a breakdown by denomination, and that seems more demanding. I mean, you might think in vague terms for the census, oh yes, well, I know I'm not Hindu or Muslim, so I would call myself a Christian. Whereas if you come down to it and say, well, are you C of E? Are you Methodist? Are you Baptist? You think, oh, well, actually, no, I'm not really any of those things, so maybe I'm no religion. You can see the thought process going on there, and it's a matter of interpretation, just what people mean by how they respond to these questions.
Thank you. Just hold that thought for a moment and come back to it. I want to introduce Dr. Peter Brierley now. And Peter, you're known to many on the call, I'm sure, because of your publications on church membership in the UK. Can you explain how you compile your statistics and what the overriding picture is? Because you've been doing this for so many years, and how you've seen it, the trend progress while you've been doing your work.
Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. I've been involved in different types of research, to be honest, and in terms of the Christian parameters, I look at three broad areas which I would define as religious adherents, religious members of a church, and like David, focus on also on attendance. The adherence really comes from the census that we now ask in a religion question. In England, it's just Christian, but in Scotland and Northern Ireland, they break it down by denomination, which is very helpful. Adherents are simply loosely affiliated, and somebody who stands up and says, what's your religion? And someone says, Church of England. It doesn't really mean an awful lot. They may or may not go. They may or may not believe in God or Jesus, but they will call themselves Christian for whatever reason. Membership I collect by writing to all the different denominations in the country, 245 of them at the last count, every 2 or 3 years, not so recently because of the COVID hiccup and the difficulty of collecting any numbers during that period. But prior to that, I would focus on membership and the different churches define it in different ways. Some have a membership list, some just have an alternative list which they call membership. The Roman Catholics don't have any concept of membership. You're either in the Catholic population, which is the adherents, or you are a mass attendance. But I publish the membership figures for all the different denominations and have been doing that now for 50 years, long time. Then on attendance, this is people who are actually going to church. So I focus on the Christian religion, and I have focused on different countries at different times. And the way one collects or gets attendance information, you can get it collectively, like the Church of England will publish the number of people they go to church on a Sunday, on an average Sunday, the usual Sunday attendance, or the average Sunday attendance, which is not quite the same thing.
What is the trend that you've discovered in church attendance over the last few decades?
That's very easy. It's declining, and has been declining for a long time. The key question at this present moment is, because there were so many restrictions in the COVID years of 20 and 21, and in fact the restrictions didn't finish until April 22, recent attendance is not a good proxy for total attendance. Numbers are coming up. The Church of England are publishing numbers, and they're an important source because they're a big church and they have a very good statistical department. And their numbers have crept up, but they haven't reached the pre-pandemic levels yet. They're 15-20% behind. But what we don't know now is how many people are live streaming, watching a church service at home on the television or iPad or whatever it may happen to be. And this is a new situation, and there hasn't been much research on that yet, published on an overall way.
Interesting thought to end on there. Thank you, Peter. I wonder if I could encourage you to have a discussion with one another now. What I would like to ask you is about non-religion. This figure for non-religion, which was high, David, as we were saying, in the British Social Attitudes Survey and lower in the Census. But all of you have described declining trends in attendance, particularly amongst the churches. How are we to understand non-religion, and what research is going on about it at your level? I wonder, perhaps I could ask you, David, first of all, and then Conrad.
There's enormous interest, of course, in non-religion as a phenomenon, and oddly, a whole subfield within the sociology of religion has opened up, the sociology of non-religion. People are writing books about what it is to be non-religious. Some of us tend to think, well, it just means that you're not very interested. Others think that it has some more positive connotations, and it suggests that people have a particular, more humanistic orientation, for example. So this is very much a subject of live debate, but at a minimum, of course, it simply means people who decided not to tick one of the religion boxes, either on the census or on a survey form, because they don't really feel that they identify now with the religion. That doesn't, as I said before, mean they have no religious beliefs or never go to church. But I think it does suggest that they are, in general, leading secular lives with relatively little contact with religious or religious worldviews.
Do you think that's rather a blunt instrument to offer just one box for non-religion?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, of course, we would ideally want to know more about their worldviews or belief systems, perhaps what they do in terms of praying or meditating, whether they might consider themselves to be spiritual in some sense, even if not religious. So this is an extremely complex phenomenon that we would approach with a whole battery of questions. But this is what we've got to work with, at least on the very big data sources.
Conrad, can I ask you what research Pew might be doing on this at the moment?
Well, we're doing a lot on this. We actually have always been interested in non-religion, and we have a report we're working on digging into the typology, the different kinds of people in this category in the US. But I wanted to address more broadly the issue that you're raising, that we have this discrepancy between different data sources, and suggest that the reason why that's the case is that many countries like England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, the US are in a transition. And so you have a lot of people who grew up with religious socialization, and it's not sticking, it's not a salient part of their lives. So depending on how you ask them questions, they'll respond differently. And 50 years ago, there would have been fewer people in that category. So this difference in measurement would be less consequential. And on the other hand, there are certain subgroups for whom the way you ask a question doesn't make so much difference. In most countries of the world, regardless of how you ask the question, somebody who could be classified as Muslim will tend to be identify as Muslim, whether you ask the British social attitudes question or the census question. And I want to give credit to David, who a couple of decades ago presented an idea of a secular transition that's akin to the demographic transition, which is how societies change as they go from an agricultural economy where people have lots of kids to the kind of low fertility society that we have now and all the things that accompany it. The thing that David pointed out about these transitions is that usually they don't tend to reverse themselves. Once you kind of get the toothpaste out of the tube, it doesn't usually go back in. And so we expect that in most of the societies where more and more people are identifying with no religion, that that's a trend that's unlikely in most cases to reverse.
Point here in the chat box. I don't know if Andrew Greystone, you're there, Andrew. Would you like to put it in person? You're muted.
Yep. Actually, just before I do that, Theos, which is the organisation that I do some work with, has a very interesting report on what are sometimes known as the nuns, those who tick no religion. In that report, the nuns, who are they and what do they believe, is on the Theos website. But my question kind of came mostly with my journalist hat on, because religion is an area that no one arrives at with a blank sheet. And so wise journalists are often wary of data around religion because they recognise that it can be skewed by the convictions of the people who are collecting it or by those who are financing the research. And so I was looking for wisdom from our panel on how people who are reading the data, or indeed people who are publishing it, like Theos, should take account of potential bias in that regard.
Conrad, can I come to you first on that? Because you mentioned your report is funded by the Templeton Foundation, which is a religious organisation.
It's true that John Templeton, who set up the various Templeton charities, was a person who was convinced it was important to pursue spiritual knowledge. And so he put a large part of his fortune to supporting such work. I feel like Templeton has been a wonderful partner for us because we propose every couple of years the questions that we think are important. And then that proposal is taken in by Templeton and sent out for reviewers to evaluate. People like David or Peter might review our proposals and give their expert opinion on whether this is worthwhile work or not. And we share our reports with them, but they have very limited guidance as to what we should do, or they've never said, oh, you can't release that. And I think, generally speaking, the people who receive support to do research from external organizations, as far as I know, are always acting in good faith. But it's possible that the kind of funding one receives might affect the questions you ask or the findings that you place a little greater emphasis on. I think another important reality is that doing high quality research can be very expensive. And in this current era of survey research, it's possible to do low quality online surveys a lot more cheaply than it is to do really rigorous probability based surveys. And so I think asking questions about surveys and whether they're truly representative of the population they seek to measure is an important question to ask.
Many surveys that come through to a journalist's inbox will be based on surveys of 1,000 or 2,000 people. Should journalists be touching that kind of stuff? Can you possibly indicate any social trends on the basis of 1,000 or 2,000 respondents?
The short answer is yes, you can. And what really matters is whether the number of people surveyed is representative. It's sort of a random sample or a sample weighted to be representative of the population in question. During the COVID pandemic, there were some very large surveys administered through Facebook that had hundreds of thousands of people. And there was an analysis that was published either in Science or Nature that analyzed this data and found that because of the way it was collected, that it wasn't random, it really was sort of had the statistical power of surveying about a dozen people who were surveyed randomly. So the number of respondents you have is not sufficient to evaluate the quality of a survey. However, if you want to look at subgroups in a population, if we wanted to talk about characteristics of Jews or Muslims in the UK, then a sample of 1,000 people wouldn't really be sufficient to dig into those groups, which might only be represented by 10 or 20 people in a survey of that size. But if you want to talk about Christians and people who identify with no religion in the UK, then a representative sample of that size should be sufficient.
Oh, that's interesting. David, Peter, do you want to come back on that?
Well, there's some very interesting research has been done in Australia. Australia does a census every 5 years. And the questions it asks on religion are broken down by denomination. On the census form, they list, I think, 12, 15 different denominations. So it's quite detailed. And because they do it every 5 years, trends are more easily spotted. But they have recently done a very interesting analysis. Of course, somewhere on the census form is a person's name and address. Well, the person's name especially. If they sent it in 2016 and ticked, for example, that they were Anglican, what the Australians have done is to check what they have answered in 2021 and then seen if they have ticked Anglican or whether they have ticked something else. And of course, sometimes the person who ticked Anglican may well tick no religion. And what they have done is to analyze all the people responses and what in 2016 against what they responded in 2021. And of course, it shows that the number of saying had no religion has increased quite drastically. You then say, well, okay, what do those people who say they now have no religion, what did they have in 5 years ago? And a good percentage of them did have then a religion. And what has happened in those particular years, 16 to 21, is that quite a lot of folk in effect, have just sort of given up. Of course, you can also break it down by gender and by age. There's not a great deal of difference in the gender profile, but there is a huge difference, of course, in age, where a lot of people who in 2016 were in their 30s and 40s are now reporting in 2021 that they have no religion. Equally, you can go the other way round. How many people who had no religion in 2016 now say they have a religion? And that is actually quite interesting because you can compare the converts, if that's what you want to call them, against the losses. So the Pentecostals, for example, lost 17,000 people between 2016 and 2021, but they gained 38,000. So they have gone up. Now that for most denominations, it's the other way around. They've all gone down, but they haven't gone down grump like that. They've gone down with a proportion who have gone the other way. So the issue of no religion is actually is very complex, as has already been said. But some of those who say they have no religion, that hasn't been their standing necessarily for a long time.
Thank you, Peter. Can I ask a more general question of David at this point? In all the surveys that have been done, and you've been describing the complexities about the questions and then the answers as we've just heard, is it right to write headlines to say that Britain is becoming more non-religious? Is that a proper picture of what's happening in Britain today?
I think that it is, but of course it's a matter of interpretation. And this is where we move from the data themselves to what we understand from the data. And it's the job of both academics and journalists and other commentators to come up with a story to explain what's happening. So my view is that there is indeed a story of religious decline, and people individually are becoming less religious, and socially, the country as a whole is becoming less influenced by organized religion. But different stories are possible, and there will be alternative interpretations of the evidence, which I think is entirely appropriate. And to come back to Andrew's interesting question, we should carefully distinguish, I think, between the data themselves, where it's really a matter of quality of data gathering and presentation, and the spin that's been applied to it. So I have enormous confidence in the work of people like Peter Brierley here, who has devoted his entire life as a Christian statistician to collecting what I think are the best data on Christian denominations in the country. And I think non-religious commentators would say that, notwithstanding the fact that Peter founded and worked for Christian Research, which was a resource for the churches. And indeed, Peter's leading critics were probably people in the churches as opposed to those outside them. Likewise, I think Theos does great work, and that would be recognized even by non-religious people, although Theos itself would see itself as having a mission to bring religion into the public sphere. As Conrad suggested, the danger may be more that what you decide to research and what you decide to ask can be influenced by your subjective views about what's interesting and important. And if I had a criticism of the John Templeton Foundation, for example, it wouldn't be that they interfere with the research that they sponsor, because I don't think they do, so much as that they tend to sponsor what they might hope would be good news for religion and spirituality. I'm not to say don't want to say that they do that exclusively, but I think they're probably biased in that direction. So there is a real issue there, but it's maybe not quite so straightforward as one would imagine.
We've got some questions in the chat box just to move the discussion along. Eddie, would you like to put your question?
Oh, hello, Eddie Talesford from the National Churches Trust. We're a charity that supports church buildings in particular, and I've been sort of working in sort of religion area about 20 years in total. What I struggle with is Christianity, you know, however many people say they're adherents or go along every Sunday. It's very hard to get data about what actually these different denominations do, you know, how much money do they all have, how many priests and vicars are there for the sector as a whole. And so much of the debate is mediated through the Church of England, which has statistics that it publishes and figures that it keeps. But, you know, I look at Christianity as a sector almost, you know, the same as any other sort of economic sector almost, and it's very hard to get all this data. Therefore, I think it's very underrepresented in terms of what actually goes on. You know, I mean, how many food banks are there in all the churches in the UK? And I'm not here sort of proselytizing on behalf of Christianity, but I think these are interesting facts which we just can't get hold of, because who's got the time to look at, you know, 245 different websites and find all that data? Maybe it's out there, I don't know, but I mean, there ought to perhaps be a sort of churches census that involves all those denominations, you know, once every 10 years, that looks much more internally and can find interesting information that also could be measured over time. And I think also a lot of the narrative, again, because the focus is on the Church of England, you know, every year it produces some figures, congregations up, congregations down, then we tend to sort of then downplay the growth of new forms of Christianity, whether they're Pentecostal churches or new forms of doing church. So this, I'm talking here from sort of a journalist's point of view. The narrative is A, led by the Church of England, B, it's very focused on how many people go to church, you know, once a week, and there's so much more that we could find out about.
I've had a lot of conversations with Eddie on church buildings, but he's quite right. There is a gap. Part of the problems of the decline in Christianity has been, carries with it a decline in finance, and a number of churches used to have a statistical department, which has now closed. The Baptist Union, Methodist Church are big ones which have closed, but others have closed as well. And the consequence is that the opportunity and the mechanism to ask questions like how many churches run a food bank isn't easily assessed. Yes, the Church of England could do it if they wish, because they send a questionnaire, electronic questionnaire, to every church, all 12,500 of them, every year. They could include a question about a food bank if they wanted to, but I suspect they probably wouldn't, because they've got other things they want to measure. So this is where the small 1,000, 2,000 sample surveys that different people do, which certainly may not be as reliable as a large survey, which is absolutely correct, but nevertheless it may give some indication as to the sort of numbers that are there. And when someone turns around and says, "Oh, there's 37,000 food banks run by churches or something," yes, maybe, but there is the actual number has a degree of variation, which could probably go from between 30,000 and 40,000. But unless one does such surveys, and there's quite a lot of small surveys, we can't have any idea of the numbers. And Eddie's problem, and many other people's problem, is how do we fund surveys? How do we fund research on what the church is doing? It would be wonderful if we could.
I suppose that underneath the question is how the research is used, and you've been indicating how it might be used, Eddie, and useful to you as an organisation. Can I go to Conrad Hackett on that? I guess, you have large amounts of funding, but how is your Pew research on religion used? Do you know? Do you analyse that?
Our work focuses not so much on the institutional level of religion, but on how religion affects people's lives. And that's what our reports describe in various ways. Back in September, just a couple months ago, the House of Commons Library in the UK, the Research Service for Parliament, put out a report about international freedom of religion or belief, since that's something the British government has emphasized. And they cited our work extensively, including not only our work measuring religious restrictions, but our work on the demography of religion and our survey research. So that's one example on how our research was used by this research service informing Parliament about the state of religion in the world. Our work is also cited by media around the world, papers like The Guardian, New York Times, Washington Post, and religious leaders and people of no religion, non-religious organizations cite our data to get a sense of the big picture of the work in their part of the world. We don't know local communities or religious institutions the way that you all do in your particular context, but we can provide a big picture of what's happening in the country and in the world in a way that most people don't have access to. You know the people around you, but you don't know if they reflect everyone else in the country or not. So the surveys are really useful in that regard.
Sounds like a business opportunity. I think put you in touch with one another afterwards. Just taking the discussion forward, we have another question from Leisure Paré, if that's how I pronounce your name, from the Catholic Bishops' Conference.
Yes, thank you. You did pronounce it correctly. I guess my question is in regards to discussing the conflict of interest when it comes to funders. Are there known cases where the funders are essentially influencing the way the surveys are conducted, or what and how results are relayed to the wider public? Would you say there is always a conflict of interest or some biases with that?
I don't think there's always a conflict of interest. I think it can happen. There certainly have been cases with what I would refer to as opinion polls have been conducted that are a bit, as they would be described in the political domain, as push polls. In other words, you have leading questions that are designed to generate a response that will be helpful to the organization that's sponsoring it. And those kinds of data are rightly somewhat disreputable. So far, I think we've mainly been talking about large-scale studies that are conducted much more even-handedly, either the Census, which of course is an official project, the British Social Attitude Survey, where NatCen, the data gatherer, has no particular axe to grind. The Christian Research Association, as was led by Peter Brierley, that I think was just for its mission determined to provide the best possible and most accurate information available on Christian denominations in the country. So in those sorts of cases, I'm not concerned that there is some underlying conflict of interest at all. But yes, it certainly can happen with smaller surveys or polls. And then I think it is important to see who's actually paid for the research and what they're doing with it.
I think the big question for journalists is how is the language that we use when we report these small research projects. Often the press release will say is funded by a particular group and how many people were surveyed. So, for example, I can think of stories about young people more religious in London than other parts of the country, or more young people praying than ever before, or more people using horoscopes than ever before. What is your advice as to the language that reporters should use and the questions that they should ask themselves when they get one of these press releases through by email, Conrad?
I think the important task for journalists is not to say, this is so interesting and so counterintuitive, I must report it, but to really ask, is there a explanation that could make this plausible? And in some cases, the answer might be yes. A year or so ago, I asked people on Twitter, do you think it's likely that people in London are more religious or people outside London? And most people said, oh, people in London are going to be more secular, kind of the idea we often have that urban areas are more secular than the rural areas. But in fact, census data shows that people in London are more likely to be religiously affiliated, probably because of immigration. And so there's a story where you could have what to people that follow me on Twitter seem counterintuitive, but is true according to ONS statistics. On the other hand, if you have a story that says young people in general are more religious than older people, that runs against David's secular transition theory and the trends we see. So you'd really want to ask a lot of questions to establish whether that's tenable or not, and consider carefully whether to run a story like that at all, or if it is mentioned, give a lot of context from experts and analysis of whether this is plausible. But it just might be that there's something quirky about that survey where the sample of young adults or the way the question is asked might be misleading. And in some cases, it might be better not to report a story like that.
Would you report it, Conrad, as saying a survey finds, a survey shows, a survey suggests? What's the language that's safest to use?
In my opinion, the important thing is to determine whether or not the survey is probably representative of something true that's happening in the country. If one thinks that it is true, then yes, reporting on it and having commentary would certainly be appropriate. But if it seems more likely than not that something about the survey is amiss, then I think it might be most responsible for readers not to report on it at all, even though it could be a really intriguing story.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat box here from Dave Perfect. Dave, would you like to ask it in person?
Yes, thanks, Ruth. I'm Dave Perfect. I used to be the religion or belief lead at the Equality and Human Rights Commission and drew often on the work of Peter and David. And I run a religion or belief group newsletter that sends out research and statistical information each month. And my question is, would the panelists like to see any changes in the census question on religion in England and Wales or Scotland, given they're slightly different, bearing in mind that obviously any changes made would limit comparisons over time?
You will have your own thoughts on this. My answer would be no. I think I would rather preserve the time series that we now have. There have been 3 census data points. It would be a shame, to my mind, to torpedo that and change the question, even though I would probably have preferred that England and Wales used the question that we see in Scotland as opposed to the one they did adopt. No, I would want to stick with what we've got, notwithstanding campaigns from Humanist UK and other groups.
So the question in Scotland, can you remind us what that was and how it was different, David?
It's closer to the British Social Attitude Survey about regarding yourself as belonging to a group. Okay.
But what about, I've got a question supplementary to that. We've got one box on non-religion, you've got a box on atheism, a box on humanism. You have loads of responses from people within non-religion, as Andrew was saying earlier in the Theos report, who are spiritual and they believe in the afterlife. And are there supplementary questions that should go there?
I was on the statistical office group to look at religion before they introduced the question in 2001. And everybody agreed that the religion question should be broken down by denomination. Even the Muslims and the Buddhists and even the Zoroastrians wanted that. And the then Office of Statistics refused to do that. They just simply said, no, we're not doing it. But it would be so useful if one had it.
What about expanding the non-religion area now that it's expanding in size, David?
Traditionally, census questions are very abbreviated and the options are very few because you don't have an enormous form. Now that people are mostly responding to the census online, there's more flexibility. We still have the traditional handful of tick boxes, no religion, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Muslim, so on, with just, say, 7 or so categories for world religions. But if you start writing in something in the other box, then it will use the autocomplete facility to guess what it is that you're typing in. And so you could type in humanist or atheist or agnostic or something that would give a bit more precision. But unfortunately, write-ins are not really very useful because most people don't use them. They simply use one of the original categories. And it's difficult. I'm not quite sure how best to reform the question. It would take a much longer discussion than we have time for, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Conrad.
If I could jump in, so my team analyzes census questions on religion around the world, so I have a lot of thoughts about this. First of all, the most important thing is that the census continues. A lot of countries are moving to just using administrative data, which already captures a lot of information about people, but doesn't capture religion. So for the purpose of tracking religion trends, the fact that England and Wales continue to have a census is so crucial. Second thing that happens in some countries that's worrying is a shift in asking a question differently. So it's more like the British Social Attitudes Survey with a two-part question. Do you have a religion? And then if so, what is it? Is what's asked. In some countries, they're switching and ruining trends. And if a country was willing to ask a second question about religion, what I would love to see happen is continue to have a question that's just, what is your religion? And then ask a follow-up question, is religion an important part of your daily life? That would enable us to differentiate between the people who have just kind of a nominal identity that they were born into, but don't actively practice, and those for whom religion is a really salient part of their identity.
I was actually in a meeting with Sir Ian Diamond, the national statistician, last week, I think, and he didn't say so directly, but as Conrad implies, the direction of travel is away from censuses towards using administrative data. That whole proposal has been in the works for a number of years in this country. And anyway, Ian Diamond, I think, was certainly giving the impression that he was going to recommend that the next census not go ahead, but be replaced by these substitutes. So we'll see. And I agree, it will definitely be unfortunate in relation to data collection on religion.
Wow, on that tantalizing news story, I'm afraid we have to draw the discussion to a close. Thank you all very much indeed for joining, and do join us again for our next briefing. Thank you.